The cup shattered before it ever hit the floor. Margaret didn't remember dropping it. 1 second it was warm in her hand, the next. Crack. Porcelain exploded across the kitchen tiles like a gunshot, white shards skidding across the floor in every direction. Her body froze mid-step. Her lungs locked. Her breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat, wedged there like a stone she couldn't swallow. Because she heard it again. A child's voice. Right behind her. Soft. Trembling. Broken. Barely above a whisper. "Why did you leave us?" Her fingers trembled violently as she turned. Slowly. Every muscle in her body screaming at her not to look. But the kitchen was empty. No footsteps. No open door. No shadow slipping away. Just the buzzing of the overhead light. Just the distant tick of the clock on the wall. Just silence dressed up as something worse. And then another voice. Closer this time. Right at her ear. Margaret. Her knees nearly buckled. Because no one had called her that in years. Not like that. Not with that particular weight behind it. Not like someone who remembered her. Not like someone who had been waiting for a very, very long time. Her lips parted. No sound came out. And then all at once, the lights flickered. The air in the kitchen dropped by 10 degrees in the span of a single breath. She could see it, her own breath, misting in front of her like smoke, though it was the middle of summer. And then something brushed past her leg. Small. Cold. Like a child's hand. Margaret screamed. It tore out of her, raw, ragged, primal, the kind of scream you don't plan. The kind that comes from somewhere deep and animal. And the entire house fell silent. Before we dive deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click that subscribe button, because you do not want to miss what's coming next. Margaret Hale had lived alone for 12 years. 12 quiet, predictable, deliberately uneventful years. No husband. No children. No visitors, beyond the occasional neighbor stopping by to leave a package or a plant she'd forgotten to water. No dinners she hadn't planned. No noise she hadn't made herself. She liked it that way. Or at least, that's what she told herself. Silence had become her comfort. Not the silence of peace, mind you, but the silence of chosen isolation. The kind you construct, brick by brick, until you've walled yourself so thoroughly inside it that you can almost convince yourself you're happy there. Routine had become her armor. Every morning, she woke at exactly 6:30. Tea at 7 o'clock. A short walk at 9 o'clock, the same route, the same pace, the same gray coat regardless of weather. Grocery shopping on Tuesdays. Library books returned on Thursdays. Curtains drawn by 6 in the evening. And then, silence. She had built herself a life so predictable, so deliberately contained, that there was no room left in it for surprise. No room for anything she hadn't accounted for. No room for anything that might crack the careful, quiet shell she'd spent 12 years constructing. Until 3 nights ago. That was when the dreams began. At first, they were easy to dismiss. Blurry shapes at the edge of vision. A low sound, indistinct, like crying heard through walls. A heaviness. A feeling she couldn't name and refused to examine too closely. Something that crawled beneath the skin and refused to leave even after she'd opened her eyes. She told herself it was age. 57 wasn't ancient, but it wasn't young either. The body did strange things when it started to tire. The mind played tricks. Memory scattered and reassembled itself in shapes you didn't recognize. She told herself it was stress. The letter she'd been ignoring on the kitchen counter. The doctor's appointment she'd been rescheduling. The pension forms she hadn't filed. She told herself anything that let her roll over and go back to sleep. But then, the dreams changed. They sharpened. Focused. Pulled themselves together like a photograph slowly developing in a darkroom. She could see them. Children. Standing in darkness so complete it had weight, had texture, had a cold all its own. Not one child. Not two. Dozens. Standing in rows. Standing in clusters. Standing alone and standing together, their small silhouettes barely visible against a black she couldn't see through. All staring at her. Not with violence. Not with rage. With something far more patient than rage. They were waiting. And then, without moving their lips, without drawing breath, without any of the ordinary mechanics of sound, they spoke. All of them. All at once. Why did you leave us? Margaret would jolt awake gasping, clawing at the sheets like she was trying to climb out of something. Her nightgown plastered to her skin with cold sweat. Her heart ramming against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her teeth. And every time, in the thin gray light of 3 a.m., she would press both hands flat against her chest and whisper the same thing to the ceiling. It's just a dream. It's just a dream. It's just a dream. But the words tasted hollow now. Like something she was chewing and chewing but refusing to swallow. Because deep down, beneath the tea and the routine and the 12 years of careful quiet, Margaret Hale knew. Something was trying to reach her. And it wasn't going to stop. The fourth night, she didn't wake up immediately. She felt it first. A weight. At the foot of her bed. Slow and deliberate, the way a person sits when they don't want to startle someone. Careful. Considered. Like they'd done this before and knew exactly how much pressure to apply. Her eyes opened on their own. Slow, reluctant, as if some part of her body understood that what waited on the other side of sleep was worse than any dream. The room was as she'd left it. Lamp off. Curtains closed. The red digits of the bedside clock reading 2:17 in the dark. She lay completely still. Barely breathing. And then she let her gaze travel, inch by terrible inch, down to the foot of the bed. 3 children. Standing there. Perfectly motionless. Not sitting. Standing. Close together, like they'd arrived as a group and were waiting to be acknowledged. Their faces were pale in a way that had nothing to do with the dark. Pale the way something looks when it's been drained of warmth, of color, of life. Their clothes, old-fashioned. Worn thin at the elbows and knees. The kind of clothes that had been washed too many times. Margaret's lips shook. No, no, this isn't real. Her voice was so small it barely made a sound. One of them stepped forward. A little girl. No older than 6, maybe 7. Small even for that. Her dress had tiny flowers on it, or had, once. They'd faded to ghosts of flowers. Her hair was parted on the side, the way a nurse or a mother might have pinned it with care. Her face was still. Her eyes were open. And what was in them, what made Margaret's lungs seize completely, wasn't emptiness. It wasn't blankness. It wasn't the flat effect of something inhuman. It was recognition. Deep and terrible and certain. She knew Margaret. She had always known her. You remember now, the girl said. Not a question. Not quite a statement. Something in between. Don't you? Margaret shook her head so hard her teeth clacked together. I don't know you. I've never seen you before. The girl's expression didn't shift. Didn't harden. Didn't soften. It simply stayed, like a verdict. You said you would come back. 3 words that hit her like a car at full speed. She felt them in her chest, her stomach, her throat. She felt them land somewhere old, somewhere buried, somewhere she had spent 12 years making sure she never went. That's not. But before the denial could find its shape, the room went dark. Not dimmer. Not shadowed. Dark. The total, absolute dark of a place that has never known light and never will. The kind of dark you can feel pressing on your eyeballs like thumbs. And then the sound came. Not from one direction. Not from inside the walls or beneath the floor or above the ceiling. From everywhere. From every molecule of air in the room. Crying. Children crying. Dozens of them. Overlapping, interlocking, cascading over and around each other until it became a single enormous sound, not loud, but vast. The sound of accumulated grief. The sound of years and years of waiting compressed into one unending moment. Margaret pressed her palms against her ears so hard she felt her skull bend. Stop, please stop. But she couldn't block it. Because it wasn't coming from outside her anymore. It was coming from inside. And then, hands. Small. Cold. Impossibly, terrifyingly small. Wrapping around her wrists. Pressing against her ankles. Gripping her shoulders from behind. Pulling. Not violently, that was the worst part. Not with rage or cruelty. With need. The desperate, clinging need of something that has been alone for too long. Clawing. Scratching. Margaret screamed until the sound scraped her raw, and woke up on the floor. She was on her hands and knees on the bedroom carpet. Her chest heaving so hard she thought something might tear inside it. Her entire body shaking in waves, uncontrollable, like a fever breaking. The room was empty. Still. Normal. The lamp was off. The curtains were closed. The clock read 2:17 a.m. She stayed on her hands and knees for a long time. Until her breathing slowed enough to be called breathing instead of drowning. Until her hand stopped shaking enough to push herself upright. She sat on the edge of the bed. And looked down at her arms. Her blood went cold. Marks. Across both arms, from wrist to elbow, crisscrossing, finger marks. Red. Faint but unmistakable. Pressed into the skin with purpose. Small. Child-sized. She stared at them for a very long time. And did not say that it was just a dream. The next morning, she did not leave the house. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror for almost 20 minutes, staring at herself the way you stare at a stranger whose face you're convinced you've seen somewhere before. Dark hollows beneath her eyes, carved deep. Her skin had taken on a quality she could only describe as thin, like the surface of milk just before it boils. Her hands wouldn't stop performing a low, constant tremor. Her lips were pressed together in a line so tight they turned white at the edges. This isn't real, she told her reflection. Her reflection said nothing. But it looked as convinced as she felt, which was not at all. She tried everything that day. Television, she turned it up loud, filled every corner of the house with noise, let daytime programs bleed into afternoon movies, bleed into evening news. Background noise. Proof that the world was still ordinary. Tea, cup after cup, until her hands were warm and her stomach was full of something familiar and routine. A book, one she'd read perhaps 30 times, the kind where you know exactly what's coming on every page and the predictability is the whole point. None of it worked. Because underneath the television noise and the tea warmth and the familiar words, she could still hear them. Faint. Constant. Patient the way water is patient, not hurrying, not forcing, just wearing at the stone day after day after day. Why did you leave us? She pressed her palms against her ears. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it. But here was the thing she was slowly, unwillingly beginning to understand. The voices weren't coming from the house. They weren't in the walls. They weren't seeping through the floor. They weren't being carried on the air like sound normally travels. They were coming from inside her. From the part of her she'd spent 12 years bricking over, paving flat, painting over with routine and silence and the comfortable lie of a life that required nothing from her. From somewhere she'd sealed shut and walked away from and told herself she'd forgotten. By the 6th night, Margaret stopped trying to sleep. Every light in the house blazing. Television screaming at full volume. Coffee she didn't taste, cup after cup, growing cold before she finished it. She sat upright in her armchair in the living room, back straight, eyes wide, daring herself not to blink. Anything to stay awake. Anything to hold the line. But exhaustion is not something you can outrun. It doesn't get tired. It doesn't get discouraged. It doesn't take breaks. At some point, she couldn't say when, couldn't say how, it swallowed her whole. And they were there before her eyes had fully closed. More than before. Many more. The living room had ceased to be a living room. It had become something else, a space that existed in two places at once, a room that was both here and somewhere else entirely. And in that somewhere else, the children were packed wall to wall, some sitting, some standing, some pressed so close to her that she could see the texture of their clothing, the faint freckles on their cheeks, the clouding of their small cold breath. All watching her. Some crying silently, not performing grief, just existing inside it, the way you exist inside rain. Some completely still. Waiting. You left us. You promised. We waited so long. Their voices rose and wove together, not cacophony but something almost musical, something that resonated in the chest cavity, something that hurt the way certain songs hurt. Margaret clutched her head with both hands. Stop, I don't know you. I don't remember. A boy stepped forward from the crowd. 8 years old, maybe 9. Dark hair. A pale blue hospital bracelet still fastened to his thin wrist. His voice was calm in the way of someone who has long since moved past anger and arrived at something older and quieter. You held my hand, he said. When I was scared in the dark, you held my hand and you told me I wasn't alone. A girl appeared beside him, different age, different face, same hollow patience in her eyes. You brushed my hair, she said. Every morning. Even when you didn't have to. Even when nobody made you. Another child. You sang to me when the pain was bad. Another. You told me my name mattered. You told me I mattered. You told me someone would always come. The memories arrived without permission then. Not gently. Not slowly. Not the way a door eases open. They crashed. A hospital. Not the gleaming, modern kind. The old kind. The kind that existed in the gap between official record and official knowledge. The kind with long corridors that smelled of industrial cleaning fluid and something underneath it, something older, sadder, harder to name. A ward at the far end. Down a hallway that the other staff walked past a little faster than necessary. Behind a door that was never left open. In a wing that wasn't on the public maps. The children's ward. Her ward. Margaret was there. 20 years younger. 30 pounds lighter. Moving with a quickness and a surety she hadn't had since, her hair darker, her eyes clearer, her hands steady and sure as she moved from bed to bed in her nurse's uniform. She checked pulses. Changed dressings. Recorded readings in careful handwriting on dog-eared clipboards. She handed out cups of water and small paper pills and the particular brand of reassurance that only comes from someone who genuinely means it. She crouched beside a small bed where a boy lay curled on his side, watching her with huge, uncertain eyes. It's going to be okay, she told him, and what was remarkable about it was that she said it like she believed it. Like certainty was something she could give away. Will you come back tomorrow? He asked. Of course I will. A girl 2 beds over, not looking up from the threadbare stuffed rabbit in her arms. Promise? I promise. She meant it. That was the thing. That was the thing that the present-day Margaret, watching herself from some terrible vantage point outside time, could not look away from. She had meant it. There had been a version of her who walked into that ward every morning with her whole heart in her hands. But the memory didn't stop there. It wasn't kind enough to stop there. The lights in the ward dimmed. The temperature dropped. The sounds of the ward shifted, the children's soft breathing replaced by adult voices, sharp and clipped and administrative. Staff meetings. Budget meetings. The particular vocabulary of institutions that have run out of care and are now rationing what's left. Resources have been reallocated. The ward will be operating at reduced capacity. We need you to manage the shortfall. We understand this isn't ideal. The meetings happened more frequently. The ward received less. The children received less. Sleep became a rumor. The hours stretched. The weight accumulated. Margaret moved through it, all of it, on something that was no longer energy and wasn't quite will. Something more like momentum. Something borrowed from a reserve she didn't know she'd emptied. And then, a conversation she had tried, for 12 years, to bury deep enough that it would decompose. A hallway. Her colleague, Anna, wide-eyed, exhausted, holding a mug of cold coffee like a life raft. I heard about the transfer offer, Anna said quietly. Margaret said nothing. Are you seriously considering it? Still nothing. Margaret. Anna's voice was careful, precise, the way you speak to someone standing at the edge of something. If you go, they won't replace you. Not properly. You know that. A long silence. I know, Margaret said at last. Then. I can't stay. The words came out quiet and flat and final. I'm breaking, Anna. I'm breaking, and if I don't leave before I break all the way, I'll be no good to anyone. Anna looked at her for a long time. And them, she asked. Not accusatory. Not cruel. Just asking the question that had no good answer. Margaret looked through the small window in the ward door. At the beds. At the small shapes in them. At the faces turned toward the door, watching for someone who cared, waiting for someone who'd come back. They'll assign someone else, she said. It was the last lie she told herself that year. Because they both knew that they wouldn't. If you're still watching, type I'm still here in the comments right now. We see every single one of you. Margaret came back to herself on the living room floor. She was on her knees. She didn't know how she'd gotten there. Her cheeks were wet and her throat was raw and her hands were pressed flat against the carpet like she was trying to grip the ground, trying to stop herself from being pulled somewhere worse. The children surrounded her. More than she could count. She'd stopped trying. I didn't know, she heard herself say, and even as it left her mouth she felt how weak it was, how paper-thin. You left us. You promised. We waited. I couldn't stay. She said it loud, said it to the floor, said it to the room and to all of them and most of all to herself. I was drowning. I was. The little girl with the faded flower dress stood directly in front of her. Her voice was very quiet. You were everything we had. 3 words. They dropped into Margaret like stones into still water, and the ripples went all the way down. She pressed a hand over her mouth. Because here was the part she couldn't argue with. Couldn't negotiate around. Couldn't explain. Away with exhaustion or circumstance or the perfectly valid and completely insufficient reality of her own pain. She had been everything they had. And she had chosen to become something else. I was afraid, she whispered through her fingers. And we weren't? The little girl's voice didn't rise. Didn't sharpen. It was the same measured, patient quiet it had always been. But those 2 words rearranged something fundamental inside Margaret Hale. Because of course they were afraid. There were sick children in an underfunded ward with nowhere to go and no one left who knew their names, and yes, she had been the one drowning, she had been the one breaking, she had been the one who couldn't carry 1 more ounce of anything without coming apart completely. But they had been afraid too. And they had not had the option to leave. The nights that followed were something Margaret would carry for the rest of her life. She stopped fighting. There was nothing noble about it. It wasn't acceptance. It wasn't peace. It was simply the realization that she had been running for 12 years and whatever she had been running from had been running at the same pace the entire time, never tiring, never falling behind, simply keeping pace until she couldn't keep hers any longer. Every night, they came. And every night, they asked the same thing. Not for vengeance. Not for retribution. Not for any of the dramatic horror she would have found easier to handle. Remember us. Say our names. Don't forget us again. She sat on the bedroom floor in the dark, not because she'd collapsed, but because she'd chosen it, and she spoke into the empty room. Daniel. The name came from somewhere she hadn't accessed in more than a decade. A file she thought she'd sealed. Sarah. A pause. Michael. They arrived one at a time. Fragile. Uncertain. Like finding your footing on ice. Thomas. Grace. Lucy. Ben. But there were too many. There had always been too many. There were names she couldn't find. Faces she could see but couldn't match to words. Small particulars, a laugh, a habit, a way of holding a spoon, floating free of any name to attach to. She sobbed into her hands. I'm sorry. Not a performance. Not a script. Not the kind of sorry you say when you've bumped into someone in a doorway. The kind that lives in the body. The kind that costs something. I'm so sorry. But the silence that answered her was worse than accusation. Because silence meant not enough. And she knew deeply, finally, without any more negotiation, that she was right. One night, she couldn't have said which one, she stopped waiting for them. She prepared instead. She moved through the house methodically. Turned off every light. Drew every curtain. Turned off the television. Unplugged the radio. Removed every source of noise and distraction and buffer. And then she went to her bedroom. And she sat on the edge of the bed. And she waited. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the clock glowed the same time it always did when they came. The temperature dropped. They arrived. Not with sound or spectacle. Not with flickering lights or slamming doors. Simply present. Filling the room with a fullness that had nothing to do with volume. All of them. Every single one. The crying had stopped. The accusations had stopped. The room was simply full. Of presence. Of waiting. Of something that needed witnessing. Margaret looked at them. Really looked. Not flinching. Not looking away. Not trying to explain or defend or escape. Just seeing them. Every face. Every pair of eyes. Every small body in its worn clothing. She said, at last. I remember. No answer. I remember leaving. Her breath hitched and she let it. I remember the morning I made the call. I remember packing the box of my things. I remember walking out of that ward without looking back because I knew if I looked back I wouldn't be able to go. She swallowed hard. I remember choosing to go anyway. The room was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. I don't deserve forgiveness, she said. I know that. I'm not asking for it. Her hands, resting on her knees, were no longer trembling. But I am asking, please, let me remember you now. All of you. The way I should have always remembered you. The little girl stepped forward. How? She asked. Simple. Serious. I'll write your names, Margaret said. Everyone I can find in my memory. I'll write them down. I'll say them out loud. And the ones I've lost. Her voice cracked clean through. I'll carry them anyway. I'll carry the shape of them, even without the names. I'll carry the fact of them. I won't pretend they didn't exist just because I've been pretending for 12 years. A silence that went on and on. Then the little girl asked, soft as snow. Do you remember mine? And Margaret felt it, the floor dropping out from under her. The particular dread of the worst kind of failure. She searched. She searched, went through every name and face and detail she'd assembled over the last desperate weeks. But the little girl's name was gone. And the look in those small eyes, it wasn't rage. It wasn't cruelty. It was the look of someone who has been told, one more time, that they are forgettable. disappointment, deep, quiet, final. It was the worst thing Margaret had ever seen. Right now, if this story has reached somewhere inside you, like this video, it costs you nothing and it means everything to us. The children began to fade. Not dramatically. Not the way things disappear in horror, suddenly, violently, with noise and light. They dissolved. The way morning mist dissolves when the sun has finally gotten serious. Slowly. Gently. Without resistance. As if they had been holding themselves together for this long with enormous effort, and now that something had finally been acknowledged, now that someone had finally sat still and looked at them, they could let it go. Margaret reached out. Wait, please, wait. Her hands meant nothing. 1 by 1 and 2 by 2, and then in groups of 5, 10, 20, they released. The boy with the hospital bracelet. The girl with the stuffed rabbit she'd carried from another time. The children whose names she'd found and the children whose names she'd lost. The ones who'd cried and the ones who'd waited and the ones who'd simply stood and been present in the way of something that refuses to disappear entirely, no matter how hard the world tries to make it. Until only the little girl remained. She stood in the center of the room. And she looked at Margaret for a long time with those eyes that had seen so much waiting. We just wanted to be remembered, she said at last. And it was the simplest thing. The smallest thing. The most devastating thing. I know, Margaret whispered. I know. The little girl nodded once. And dissolved. The room was empty. The clock read 2:17 a.m. And for the first time in weeks, maybe years, the house was simply quiet. Not the silence of something absent. Not the silence of something waiting. Just silence. Margaret sat in it for a very long time. And cried. Days came and went. The dreams did not return. The voices did not return. The weight at the foot of the bed did not return. And Margaret, she did not return to her old life either. Because she'd realized something. The old life, the routine, the curtains, the tea at 7 o'clock and the walk at 9 o'clock and the careful, armored silence, had not been a life she'd built toward anything. It had been a life she'd built away from something. Away from a ward. Away from a memory. Away from the faces of children who had trusted her and whom she had failed. She had spent 12 years calling that silence peace. It was not peace. It was just an absence she'd been standing in. So instead of returning to it, she began. The notebooks were her idea. Plural. Many of them. She drove to the stationery shop on a Tuesday, a trip she hadn't planned, and bought 12. One for each year. One for each year she'd spent not doing this. She began at the beginning. The names she could remember. She wrote them with care, with deliberate attention, the way you write something you want to make permanent. Daniel Marsh. Sarah Okonkwo. Michael Petrov. Thomas Hale, no relation, she'd always found it strangely moving. Grace Weston. Lucy Amara. Benjamin Clark. She wrote down everything she could attach to each name. A detail. A habit. The specific way Thomas used to straighten his blanket before the lights went out at night, making it perfectly even on all sides, a tiny act of control in a place where he controlled nothing else. The way Sarah laughed when something was actually funny, not a polite laugh, a real one, a surprised one, like joy was something that kept catching her off guard. She wrote the names she was less sure about. She put a small asterisk beside them and wrote, I believe this was you. I'm trying. She wrote the names she couldn't find. She wrote, in the space where names should be, I knew you. I don't know your name anymore. I am writing this line so that the fact of you is not lost, even when your name is. You existed. You mattered. Someone held your hand once. That happened. I will not let it unhappen. She filled the first notebook in 3 days. Started the second. She called the hospital. The original one, long since restructured, renamed, barely resembling what it had been. She spoke to 3 different administrators before she reached someone who understood what she was looking for. Old records. Children's ward records. The kind of records that institutions tend to misplace when the story they tell is inconvenient. It took weeks. Months. But they came. Piece by piece. Faxed documents, scanned ledgers, photocopied intake forms with names and institutional handwriting that Margaret traced with her finger on the page. There you are, she thought, each time. I found you. She had a name, now, for everything she was doing. Not penance. She didn't believe penance was real, not really. You couldn't undo what you'd done by suffering adequately in place of it. The people you'd failed were still failed. But there was something else. Something quieter. Bearing witness. The children of that ward had passed through the world, and the world had treated them as though they were barely there, under-resourced, overlooked, shuffled through systems that had run out of capacity for them long before they had run out of need. And then Margaret, the one person who had promised to stay, had left. And they had spent years, or whatever the equivalent of years was in whatever place they'd ended up, being simply not remembered. She couldn't give them back the years. But she could make sure that someone, in some corner of the world, knew their names. So she kept writing. Every morning at 7 o'clock, before the tea, before the walk, before anything else. She wrote. And she spoke the names out loud, into the quiet of the house, one by one by one. I remember you. I remember you. I remember you. One evening in early autumn, the kind of evening that carries that particular golden light that only lasts about 40 minutes before it's gone, Margaret closed the latest notebook and set it beside the others. She sat at her kitchen table. The same table where the cup had shattered weeks ago, porcelain splattered across tiles, her breath locked somewhere between her chest and her throat. She looked at her hands. They were steady. Not because the guilt had left her, it hadn't. She didn't think it would, and she had stopped hoping it might. The guilt was hers. She'd earned it honestly, and it was right that she carry it. But hands can be steady even when they're carrying something heavy. That, she was learning. She had an appointment next week. A meeting with a children's charity, the kind that worked with long-term care patients, the kind that had more need than staff, the kind that needed people who could show up with their whole heart even when it cost something. She'd made the call on a Thursday. Her hands had been shaking when she dialed. They weren't shaking when the woman on the other end answered. She had made no promises she didn't intend to keep. Now she sat in the golden light of a Tuesday evening and listened to the silence of her house. It was different from before. Not the silence of avoidance. Not the silence of a woman pressing her hands over her ears and humming against everything she was refusing to hear. Just quiet. The ordinary quiet of an ordinary evening. The kind you can breathe inside without drowning. She whispered, not to the room, not to anything she expected to be listening. Just out loud, into the air. I won't forget again. And then. It was so small she might have imagined it. The human mind is a remarkable instrument for filling the silences it desperately wants filled. But she felt it. A warmth. Gentle and brief, at the back of her hand. The particular warmth of something small. Of small fingers, resting for just a moment against her skin, not holding, not gripping, not pulling. Just present. Not accusing. Not angry. Not waiting. Just here. And then it was gone. Margaret sat very still. The golden light had started to go amber at the edges, the way it does just before it leaves. She breathed in. She breathed out. And for a brief, impossible moment, the kind of moment that doesn't belong to ordinary time, the kind that opens up and then closes again before you can fully account for what happened inside it, she felt, not forgiven, no, she would not cheapen it by calling it that. But released. Not from responsibility. Not from memory. Not from the long, steady work of carrying what she carried and showing up anyway. Released from the silence. Released from the running. released, finally, into the difficult and necessary work of staying. What would you have done in her place? When you were drowning, when everything inside you was breaking, would you have stayed? Would you have found a way? Or would you, too, have chosen yourself? There's no easy answer. Margaret was human. And humans break. That's not the whole story, but it's part of it. What matters, maybe, is not just what we do when we're strong. What matters is what we do when we come back. Let me know in the comments what you think. What her story made you feel. Whether you've ever had to carry something like this. And if this story stayed with you, if it reached somewhere real, please like, share, and subscribe. Because the next story we have for you is unlike anything we've posted before. And trust me, you'll want to be here for it.